The spring sun hung low over the bustling frontier town of Silver Creek, painting the wooden buildings in warm shades of gold. Wagons rolled slowly along the dusty streets while merchants called out to passing customers. Ladies in elegant dresses walked arm in arm beneath colorful parasols, and gentlemen tipped their hats as they exchanged greetings. Everyone in town seemed excited about the grand celebration taking place that evening at the Whitmore Manor, where some of the wealthiest families in the territory had gathered for an extravagant spring ball. Among those preparing for the event was 26-year-old Eleanor Whitmore. Unlike many of the fashionable young women in Silver Creek, Eleanor had never fit the narrow standard of beauty admired by society. She was taller than most women, with a fuller figure that had made her the target of whispers and cruel remarks ever since she was a child. Though she carried herself with grace, years of criticism had slowly chipped away at her confidence. Still, Eleanor possessed qualities that many overlooked. She was well-read, compassionate, and generous to everyone she met. She spent much of her time helping at the local church, teaching children to read, and delivering food to families struggling through difficult seasons. Those who truly knew her admired her kindness, but strangers often judged her before learning anything about the woman behind her appearance. As Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom, she carefully smoothed the deep blue satin gown her aunt had sewn by hand. It wasn't the latest fashion from New York or Boston, but it was beautiful in its own way. Tiny silver beads decorated the sleeves, catching the light from the nearby oil lamp. Her maid, Clara, smiled warmly. "You look lovely tonight, Miss Eleanor." Eleanor forced a smile. "Do I?" "You truly do." She sighed softly. "I wish people could see me the way you do." Clara adjusted the ribbon around Eleanor's waist. "The right person will." Eleanor wanted desperately to believe those words. For months she had quietly admired Charles Ashford, the handsome son of one of Silver Creek's most influential businessmen. Charles was charming, educated, and admired by nearly every family in town. More importantly, he had always been polite to Eleanor. They had spoken several times during church gatherings and charity events, and Eleanor had convinced herself that perhaps his kindness meant something more. When Charles had personally invited her to dance at the spring ball, hope had bloomed inside her heart for the first time in years. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps someone would finally see her for who she truly was. As evening settled over Silver Creek, lanterns illuminated the Whitmore Manor, filling every window with warm golden light. Elegant carriages lined the entrance while musicians tuned their violins inside the grand ballroom. The celebration was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Fresh roses decorated every table. Laughter echoed through the hall as couples danced gracefully across the polished wooden floor. Eleanor entered quietly, feeling dozens of eyes turned toward her. Some smiled politely. Others whispered behind folded fans. She lowered her gaze, pretending not to notice. Charles soon approached wearing an immaculate black suit. "You came," he said with a practiced smile. "You invited me." "I did." He extended his hand. "Would you honor me with the first dance?" Eleanor's heart raced. The orchestra began playing a gentle waltz as they stepped onto the dance floor. For a few wonderful moments, everything felt perfect. Charles smiled. People watched. Eleanor allowed herself to dream. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter. But dreams can disappear in an instant. As the music ended, Charles released her hand and looked around at the gathering crowd. A smug grin spread across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly enough for the ballroom to fall silent. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward them. "I suppose many of you assumed I intended to court Miss Whitmore." Eleanor froze. A knot formed in her stomach. Charles laughed lightly. "I invited her only because my friends dared me to." Several young men near the refreshments chuckled. One even applauded. Charles continued without hesitation. "Can you imagine me marrying someone like this? She's far too large to be my bride." Gasps rippled through the room. Some guests looked horrified. Others laughed uncomfortably, unwilling to challenge one of the town's most influential families. Eleanor felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her feet. Her cheeks burned. Her vision blurred with tears. She searched the faces surrounding her, hoping someone would speak in her defense. No one did. Even those who pitied her remained silent. The silence hurt almost as much as Charles's cruel words. Without saying a single word, Eleanor turned and hurried through the grand doors of the ballroom. Her tears spilled freely as she crossed the garden, ignoring voices calling after her. She climbed into a waiting carriage and instructed the driver to take her anywhere away from Silver Creek. As the lights of the manor disappeared behind her, Eleanor pressed her trembling hands against her face. In that heartbreaking moment, she believed every cruel thing ever said about her. She did not know that beyond the edge of the familiar frontier, fate was preparing to lead her toward people who would judge her not by her appearance, but by the strength of her heart, and that one unexpected meeting would change her life forever. The carriage rolled through the silent countryside long after the lights of Silver Creek had disappeared behind the distant hills. Eleanor Whitmore sat quietly inside, tears streaming down her cheeks as the painful memory of the ballroom replayed over and over in her mind. Charles Ashford's mocking laughter still echoed in her ears, accompanied by the silence of the crowd that had stood by and watched her humiliation. At last, she asked the driver to stop. "I need to be alone," she whispered. The elderly driver looked at her with concern. "Miss Whitmore, it's not safe to wander out here after dark." "I'll be all right." Reluctantly, he nodded. "I'll wait by the road for a while. If you change your mind, I'll be here." Eleanor thanked him and walked away, her blue dress brushing against the dry desert grass. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and juniper. Above her, thousands of stars glittered across the endless sky, brighter than she had ever seen from town. She wandered without any destination, hoping the quiet wilderness would soothe the ache in her heart. Instead, the emptiness only made her loneliness feel deeper. "Why wasn't I enough?" she whispered into the darkness. No one answered. Only the desert wind replied, rustling through the tall grasses. As the hours passed, Eleanor lost all sense of direction. The moon climbed higher, casting pale silver light over rocky hills and towering cactus plants. The road she had left behind was nowhere to be seen. Her feet began to ache. The heavy satin gown that had seemed so elegant at the ball now felt impossibly cumbersome. Its hem snagged on thorny bushes, and the delicate shoes she had worn for dancing were poorly suited for rough ground. Finally, exhausted, Eleanor sat beneath the broad branches of an old mesquite tree. "I've made a terrible mistake," she murmured. Just then, she heard something. Hoofbeats. Soft at first. Then closer. Her heart pounded. She quickly stood, scanning the darkness. Several riders emerged from between the rocks, their horses moving with remarkable silence. Their clothing was practical for the rugged landscape, and each rider carried a bough across his back. They watched Eleanor carefully but made no threatening move. Fear tightened her chest. She had heard countless stories in town about Apache warriors, but she also knew many of those stories were exaggerated by fear and misunderstanding. Even so, standing alone in the desert before a group of strangers was enough to make anyone uneasy. The riders exchanged quiet words in their own language before one of them, an older scout with calm eyes, slowly approached. In careful English, he asked, "Are you hurt?" Eleanor blinked in surprise. I'm only lost." The scout glanced toward the empty horizon. "You are far from the road." "I know." He noticed the tears on her face but did not ask why she had been crying. Instead, he simply said, "No one should stay here alone tonight." Another rider handed Eleanor a waterskin. She hesitated for only a moment before accepting it gratefully. "Thank you." The cool water eased her dry throat. The older scout smiled gently. "Our camp is nearby. You may rest there until morning." Every lesson Eleanor had grown up hearing urged her to refuse. Yet nothing about these men matched the frightening tales she had been told. Their expressions showed caution, not cruelty. After a long pause, she nodded. "I would appreciate your kindness." One of the scouts led her horse while Eleanor walked beside them toward the distant mountains. The journey was quiet. No one questioned her or made her feel unwelcome. As dawn painted the eastern sky with shades of orange and pink, they reached a hidden valley nestled between towering cliffs. Smoke curled gently from cooking fires, and families were beginning their morning routines. Children laughed as they chased one another through the camp, while elders greeted the returning scouts with warm smiles. Eleanor looked around in astonishment. This was not the fierce encampment she had imagined from the stories she had heard. It was a thriving community filled with families, craftsmen, hunters, and healers working together. Women prepared breakfast over open fires. Children carried bundles of firewood. Older men repaired tools while sharing stories. The camp felt peaceful. The scouts escorted Eleanor to a large lodge near the center of the settlement. "The chief will decide how we may help you," the older scout explained. A few moments later, the entrance opened. A tall man stepped inside. His bearing was calm and confident, and his presence commanded respect without a single harsh word. Though dressed simply, every movement reflected years of experience and quiet strength. His dark eyes met Eleanor's. There was no ridicule in them. No mockery. No judgment. Only curiosity. The older scout briefly explained how they had found the lost traveler in the desert. The chief listened carefully before turning his attention back to Eleanor. "You have traveled a difficult road," he said in measured English. She lowered her eyes. "Yes. You are safe here." Those 4 words struck Eleanor more deeply than she expected. Safe. After the cruel rejection she had endured only hours earlier, it was the first time anyone had spoken to her with genuine compassion. The chief continued, "You may stay until you have regained your strength. No guest should face the desert alone." Tears once again filled Eleanor's eyes, but these were different from the tears she had shed at the ballroom. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. Little did Eleanor know that this meeting with the Apache leader would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she believed about herself, about others, and about what it truly meant to be seen for who she was. The first morning Eleanor awoke in the Apache camp, she was greeted not by whispers or judgmental stares, but by the gentle sounds of daily life. The sun had just begun to rise above the rocky cliffs, bathing the valley in soft golden light. Smoke drifted from cooking fires, children laughed as they chased one another through the camp, and the scent of fresh bread and herbs filled the crisp morning air. For a moment, Eleanor forgot where she was. Then she remembered the ballroom, Charles's cruel words, and the long, lonely walk into the desert. A familiar sadness settled over her heart. A young woman named Nita stepped into the lodge carrying a wooden bowl filled with warm stew. "You should eat," she said with a welcoming smile. "You need your strength." Eleanor accepted the bowl gratefully. "Thank you." Nita sat beside her. "My grandfather says guests are a gift. We are happy you are here." The simple kindness in those words surprised Eleanor. No one in Silver Creek had ever spoken to her that way. Over the next several days, Eleanor slowly recovered from her exhausting journey. She expected to be treated like an outsider, but instead she found herself welcomed with quiet respect. No one asked intrusive questions about her appearance or why she had arrived alone. They simply allowed her time to heal. As she regained her strength, Eleanor offered to help with daily chores. She gathered firewood with the younger women, carried water from a nearby stream, and helped prepare meals over the open fires. Although many tasks were unfamiliar, the women patiently showed her how everything was done. Sometimes they laughed together when Eleanor made mistakes. But the laughter was warm, never cruel. One afternoon, while helping weave baskets from long willow branches, Eleanor admitted, I'm afraid I'll never be very good at this. An older craftswoman smiled. No one is skilled on the first day. She gently adjusted Eleanor's hands. Patience teaches what pride never can. Those words stayed with Eleanor long after the lesson ended. Each evening, the camp gathered around large fires to share stories, songs, and memories of their ancestors. Eleanor listened with fascination as elders spoke about respecting the land, honoring family, and finding balance between strength and compassion. The stories challenged many of the assumptions she had grown up believing. These were not the frightening people described in the tales she had heard as a child. They were parents, grandparents, hunters, healers, and storytellers who cared deeply for one another and for the world around them. One afternoon, while Eleanor was tending a small herb garden beside the healer's lodge, the chief approached. "May I join you?" he asked. She stood politely. "Of course." He knelt beside the garden and carefully examined several growing plants. "Our healer tells me you have been helping every day. I don't like feeling useless." He smiled. "You have been far from useless." Eleanor looked down. "I only wish I could repay everyone's kindness." "You already have." She looked at him, puzzled. "You work with a willing heart," he explained. "That is more valuable than many gifts." No one had ever complimented her so sincerely. In Silver Creek, compliments usually focused on appearance or social status. Here, people noticed character. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and the chief spoke often. He shared stories of the mountains, the changing seasons, and the traditions passed down through generations. Eleanor, in turn, described life in Silver Creek, the books she loved, and the children she had taught to read. Their conversations flowed easily. Neither tried to impress the other. Instead, they listened. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of crimson and gold, the chief asked quietly, "Why were you crying when my scouts found you?" Eleanor hesitated. She had avoided speaking about that night. Finally, she answered. "I believed someone cared for me." The chief remained silent, allowing her to continue. "He invited me to a grand ball. I thought." She paused, swallowing hard. "I thought he saw me for who I was. But he did not." She shook her head. "He laughed at me in front of everyone." The chief looked toward the distant horizon. "There are people who judge only what their eyes can see. And there are others. There are others who see with both their eyes and their hearts." His words settled gently into Eleanor's thoughts. For the first time in years, she began to wonder whether her worth had never depended on the opinions of those who mocked her. Days turned into weeks. The sadness that had once weighed heavily upon her heart slowly began to lift. She laughed more freely. She smiled without forcing it. She discovered strength she had never known she possessed. Most surprising of all, she no longer felt invisible. Among the Apache community, she was valued for her kindness, her willingness to learn, and the compassion she showed others. No one expected her to become someone different to earn respect. As the stars appeared one evening above the quiet valley, Eleanor realized something remarkable. She had traveled into the desert believing she had lost everything. Instead, she had found something far more precious than she had ever imagined, a place where she was accepted not because she was perfect, but because she was simply herself. And without either of them fully realizing it, the friendship between Eleanor and the chief was beginning to grow into something much deeper. Several weeks had passed since Eleanor arrived in the hidden valley. What had begun as a temporary refuge had slowly become a place where she felt something she had not experienced in years: peace. The mornings were filled with purpose. She helped prepare meals, gathered herbs for the healer, and taught several children simple English words while they, in return, patiently taught her phrases from their own language. Every day brought another lesson, another smile, another reminder that kindness often spoke louder than words. Yet despite the happiness she had begun to discover, one wound remained unhealed. The memory of that night in Silver Creek still lingered. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the calm waters of the nearby stream, she heard Charles Ashford's cruel voice echoing in her mind. "She's far too large to be my bride." She would quickly turn away, trying to silence the painful memory. One evening, after the day's work was finished, the chief invited Eleanor to walk with him to a high ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and violet. A cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and sage as birds circled lazily overhead. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a flat stone overlooking the valley below. "It is beautiful here," Eleanor said softly. The chief nodded. "The land reminds us that every season has its purpose. Even harsh winters prepare the earth for spring." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I hope that is true for people as well." "It is." She looked down at her hands. "I wish I believed that." The chief remained quiet, giving her time to gather her thoughts. At last, Eleanor spoke. "I haven't told you everything. You only need to tell what your heart is ready to share." She took a slow breath. "The man I cared for." Her voice trembled. "He rejected me because of my appearance." She stared toward the fading sunset, unable to meet the chief's eyes. "He stood before an entire ballroom and laughed at me." Her fingers tightened together. "He said no man could ever truly love someone who looked like me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the whispering wind filled the silence. Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. "I believed him." The confession seemed to drain years of hidden sorrow from her heart. "I spent so much of my life trying to become someone else. I skipped meals. I wore uncomfortable clothes to hide myself. I smiled when people mocked me because I thought maybe they were right." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I kept thinking that if I changed enough, someone would finally think I was worthy of love." The chief listened without interruption. When she finished, he gently picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground. He held it in his hand for a moment before placing it beside a wild desert flower growing between two rocks. "Look at these," he said. Eleanor wiped her eyes. "The flower is delicate. The stone is strong. They are completely different." She nodded. "Would you say one has value because it resembles the other?" "No. They each have their own purpose." He looked at her with calm, unwavering eyes. "Our people believe every person is created with gifts that cannot be measured by appearance alone." Eleanor felt her breath catch. The chief continued. "I have watched you these past weeks." "You have?" "I have seen your patience with children." He smiled gently. "I have seen you comfort the elderly. You work without seeking praise. You listen before you speak. You carry sadness, yet you still choose kindness." His voice remained steady. "Those are the qualities that reveal a person's true beauty." Eleanor lowered her gaze, overcome with emotion. "No one has ever described me that way." "Then they fail to truly see you." He paused for a moment before speaking the words that would remain in Eleanor's heart forever. "You are perfect to me." Eleanor looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "Perfect?" He nodded. "Not because you have no flaws. None of us do. But because the person you are brings light to those around you. You do not need to become someone else to deserve respect. You already deserve it." For the first time in many years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps her worth had never depended on fitting someone else's idea of beauty. The heavy burden she had carried for so long began to lift. She smiled through her tears. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost." "What is that?" "Hope." The chief smiled warmly. "Hope has always been within you. Sometimes another person simply helps you find it again." As darkness settled over the valley, the first stars appeared above the mountains. They sat together in peaceful silence, watching the night sky slowly come alive. Neither spoke of love. Neither made promises about the future. Yet in that quiet moment, something deeper than friendship took root between them, not built on appearance, wealth, or status, but on trust, compassion, and the certainty that each had finally found someone who truly saw the other for who they were. For Eleanor, it was the beginning of healing. And for both of them, it was the beginning of a love that neither had expected to find. Autumn arrived in the valley with cool mornings and brilliant sunsets that painted the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. Months had passed since Eleanor Whitmore first stumbled into the Apache camp, frightened and heartbroken. The woman who now walked among the people was no longer the same person who had fled the ballroom in tears. She carried herself with quiet confidence. Her laughter came easily. She no longer lowered her eyes whenever someone looked at her. The community had become her home, and every day strengthened the friendships she had built. She worked alongside the women preparing food, helped the healer organize medicinal herbs, and spent afternoons teaching children to read simple English stories. In return, they taught her their traditions, songs, and respect for the land that surrounded them. One afternoon, while Eleanor was helping gather firewood, a young scout came riding swiftly into the valley. He dismounted and spoke quietly with the chief. The chief's expression grew serious. When the conversation ended, he walked toward Eleanor. "We have visitors approaching from the east," he said. "Travelers?" He nodded slowly. One of them asked for a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. A chill ran through her. There was only one person who would search for her by name. Charles Ashford. Her hands tightened around the bundle of firewood she carried. "I don't want to see him." "You do not have to," the chief replied calmly. "But if I keep hiding, he'll always have power over my memories." The chief studied her face. "Then whatever you choose, you will not face it alone." The following morning, a small party of riders entered the valley under a flag of peace. At their head was Charles Ashford, dressed in expensive riding clothes that seemed strangely out of place in the rugged landscape. Behind him rode two hired escorts and a local guide. When Charles spotted Eleanor standing near the center of the camp, surprise flashed across his face. "There you are," he exclaimed, dismounting quickly. "Do you know how long people have been searching for you?" Eleanor remained calm. "I didn't ask anyone to search." Charles forced a smile. "Everyone feared the worst. Your family has been worried sick. I appreciate their concern." His eyes wandered around the camp before returning to her. "I've come to bring you home." The valley grew quiet. Several members of the community watched from a respectful distance, but no one interrupted. Charles took a step closer. "Eleanor. I've had time to think." She said nothing. "I made mistakes." Another step. "I was foolish." He lowered his voice. "I want another chance." For a brief moment, the old Eleanor might have believed him. The woman standing before him now was different. She remembered every laugh in the ballroom. Every whispered insult. Every lonely tear shed afterward. "What changed your mind?" she asked quietly. Charles hesitated. "I realized what I lost." "Did you?" His smile faltered. "I've changed." Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. "Then answer one question." "Anything. If I looked exactly the same as I did the night you humiliated me, if nothing else had changed, would you still be standing here asking me to return?" Charles opened his mouth but found no words. The silence answered for him. Finally, he glanced around the camp. "I've heard stories," he said carefully. "People say you've become close to their leader." Eleanor understood. It wasn't love that had brought Charles across the desert. It was pride. Perhaps even the fear of becoming the man remembered for throwing away someone others had come to respect. "I came because I thought we could begin again," he insisted. Eleanor shook her head gently. "No." He stared at her. "No. I spent years believing your opinion defined my worth." She took a slow breath. "I was wrong. Charles frowned. "You'd choose this place over your own home?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Home is where a person is treated with dignity." She glanced toward the chief, who stood quietly nearby, allowing her to speak for herself. "When I arrived here, I expected strangers. Instead, I found kindness. I expected judgment. I found acceptance. I expected people to notice only my appearance. Instead, they saw my heart." Charles looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I truly am sorry," he said. Eleanor believed that he regretted what had happened, but regret could not erase the pain he had caused or rebuild the trust he had broken. "I forgive you," she said calmly. His face brightened. "But forgiveness is not the same as returning." The hope faded from his expression. "Our paths are different now." Charles lowered his head. After a long silence, he gave a small nod. "I understand." Without another argument, he returned to his horse. Before leaving, he looked back one final time. "I hope you find happiness." Eleanor smiled. "I already have." Charles and his companions rode out of the valley, disappearing into the desert from which they had come. The chief walked over to Eleanor. "You spoke with great courage." She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. "I was afraid." "Courage is not the absence of fear," he replied. "It is choosing what is right despite fear." Eleanor looked toward the horizon where the riders had vanished. For the first time since that terrible night in Silver Creek, the painful memories no longer held power over her. She had reclaimed something far more valuable than another person's approval. She had reclaimed herself. As the evening sun dipped below the mountains, Eleanor realized that the hardest chapter of her life had finally come to an end, and a new one, filled with hope and love, was only beginning. Winter arrived gently in the valley, dusting the distant mountain peaks with snow while the desert below remained touched by golden sunlight. The seasons had changed, and so had Eleanor Whitmore. The frightened woman who had once believed she would never be worthy of love had become someone entirely different. Her confidence no longer depended on the opinions of strangers. She had discovered that true worth was measured by compassion, integrity, and the kindness a person shared with others. Life in the valley settled into a peaceful rhythm. Each morning, Eleanor joined the women in preparing meals and gathering supplies for the day. She continued teaching children to read and write English, while they eagerly taught her more words from their own language. Together they laughed over mispronounced phrases and celebrated every small success. The healer often invited Eleanor to assist with caring for the sick and elderly. Her gentle manner comforted many people, and before long, travelers passing through the region began speaking of the kind white woman who had found a home among the Apache people. One evening, as the community gathered around a large fire to celebrate the end of the harvest season, the chief stood before the people. The valley grew quiet. He looked toward Eleanor with a warm smile. "When a stranger first came to our valley," he began, "many believed we were simply offering shelter for a few days." Soft laughter spread through the crowd. "But she offered us something in return." He turned toward the families gathered around the fire. "She brought patience to our children, compassion to our elders, and friendship to every person willing to know her." Several people nodded in agreement. The chief then faced Eleanor once more. "Our people believe that the strongest families are built not by appearance, wealth, or pride, but by trust, respect, and kindness." He took a slow step forward. "Eleanor Whitmore." She looked at him, surprised. "You have become part of this community." He paused. "And if you are willing." He gently took her hand. "I would be honored to spend the rest of my life beside you." The valley fell completely silent. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. Months earlier, she had stood in another gathering, terrified and humiliated before a crowd. Tonight, she stood before people who had become her family. There was no laughter. No ridicule. Only hope. She smiled through her tears. Yes. The entire valley erupted in joyful celebration. Children cheered. Families embraced one another. Musicians began playing lively songs while friends prepared a feast that lasted long into the night. It was not a celebration of perfection. It was a celebration of love built on mutual respect. In the months that followed, Eleanor and the chief worked side by side to strengthen friendships between neighboring communities. Whenever peaceful travelers arrived, they were welcomed with generosity, regardless of where they came from. Eleanor also encouraged opportunities for learning between cultures. She believed that fear often grew from misunderstanding, and that people who listened to one another discovered they had far more in common than they imagined. Years passed. The valley flourished. Children who had once learned their first English words from Eleanor grew into confident young adults. Travelers continued sharing stories about the remarkable couple whose home was always open to those in need. One spring afternoon, Eleanor stood on the same ridge where she and the chief had once watched the sunset together. The breeze gently carried the scent of wildflowers across the valley. She thought back to the night she had fled Silver Creek believing her life was over. If someone had told her then that her greatest heartbreak would eventually lead her to her greatest happiness, she never would have believed it. The chief joined her, quietly slipping his hand into hers. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled. "I was remembering the woman who arrived here believing she wasn't enough." "And what would you tell her now?" Eleanor looked across the valley where children laughed, families worked together, and life continued peacefully beneath the wide desert sky. "I would tell her that another person's cruelty does not define her value." She squeezed his hand. "I would tell her never to measure herself by the standards of those who cannot see beyond appearances." The chief smiled. "And I would remind her of something else." She looked at him. "What?" He repeated the words that had changed her life forever. "You are perfect to me." Eleanor laughed softly through happy tears. "I finally believe it." Together they watched the sun disappear beyond the mountains, knowing that love had not found them because either of them was flawless. It had found them because they chose to see one another with compassion, honesty, and respect. And for generations afterward, the people of the valley told the story of a woman who journeyed into the desert carrying a broken heart, and discovered that the greatest beauty in the world was not found in appearance, but in the courage to love and be loved for exactly who you are.